They were amongst the last remnants of Nagumo's huge force. But these few Japanese pilots were deadly professionals, unlikely to miss their targets.
Intent on revenge, the pilots from the Hiryu soon spotted what they were looking for. An enemy carrier. It was the USS Yorktown.
The crew of the Yorktown were horrified to see the Japanese bombers approaching. They'd been hit by the Japanese before at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but this time they were prepared. The experience of the Coral Sea had taught them vital lessons in damage control, which they immediately put into action.
The 5-inch guns opened up first with loud cracks. Then came the rumble of multiple guns. The enemy bombers and fighters were under intense anti-aircraft fire from all the automatic weapons. The sky was black from shell bursts. Red tracers laced the sky. Japanese planes were falling, trailing fire, and exploding as they hit the water.
Anti-aircraft guns put up an effective barrage which destroyed many of the approaching Japanese planes. But 7 of the bombers made it through. They dodged the wall of flak coming from the carrier and dropped their bombs. They scored 3 direct hits. The bombs ripped through the flight deck and exploded deep in the heart of the ship, snuffing out the boilers. The Yorktown slowed to a halt.
It seemed like it was all over for the Yorktown.
But the Yorktown's crew were not going to give up that easily. Deep below decks, the engineers struggled to get the ship going again. But the boilers were wrecked. Thick black smoke poured into the intense heat of the engine room, choking the men. For over an hour, they worked against the odds, fixing the boilers. And by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Yorktown was operational again, making about 20 knots.
Reports from their pilots that an enemy carrier had been destroyed began to revive Japanese hopes. A second attack force was quickly launched from the Hiryu to find and destroy another of the American carriers.
At 2:40, the Hiryu's second strike force arrived and launched another devastating attack on the Yorktown. The mighty ship had taken all that she could, and soon she was listing to port. Her crew had to abandon ship.
The Battle of Midway was now to end with one final act of destruction. The Japanese believed they'd sunk 2 of the 3 US carriers. They didn't realize they'd hit the Yorktown twice. They now thought that they were fighting on equal terms with the Americans, with just 1 surviving carrier each. Based on this misapprehension, the commanders on the Hiryu now made an almost unbelievable decision. For the next 90 minutes, the battle would be put on hold.
The surviving Japanese pilots on the Hiryu had been up since before dawn, and they were exhausted by the day's constant flight operations. They were barely able to function. So now that it was thought there was only 1 remaining American aircraft carrier left to sink, the men were told that they had time to take a rest and grab a bite to eat. It was a final, fatal miscalculation.
Things were not nearly so relaxed aboard the two American carriers. The American commander, Admiral Spruance, knew that he had to find the one remaining Japanese carrier and strike it before its aircraft could strike back at his ships. And then in mid-afternoon, Spruance got his chance. One of his scout planes had located the Hiryu. At 3:30, Spruance launched his dive bombers to finish the job and avenge the Yorktown.
90 minutes later, the dive bombers appeared high above the wooden flight decks of the Hiryu and began their high-speed dives heading towards the middle. In quick succession, 4 bombs smashed into the Hiryu. They penetrated the flight deck and turned the bridge into an inferno. The last remaining Japanese carrier was on fire.
Yamamoto's ambitious Midway battle plan had ended in catastrophic failure. With his carriers gone, he'd lost vital air superiority over the Americans. He still had his big gun battleships, but they were little more than white elephants in this new era where aircraft reigned supreme. Yamamoto ordered his ships back to Japan. Just over a dozen American bombs had destroyed the cream of the Imperial Japanese fleet and altered the course of the war in the Pacific.
At the Battle of Midway, America lost just over 300 men and 1 carrier, the Yorktown. Japanese losses were far more severe. Around 250 planes had been destroyed, 4 carriers had been sunk, and 3,000 men had been killed. Years of combat experience and training had been wiped out. The aircraft carrier reigned supreme, but Japan had just lost the very men it needed to wage this kind of warfare.
Japan's naval power never recovered from its defeat at Midway on June the 4th, 1942. America built a whole new fleet of aircraft carriers, but it took 3 more years of bloodshed before the Japanese surrendered here on the USS Missouri, now moored in Pearl Harbor, where the war had all begun. Japan had been a stubborn enemy and only at last admitted defeat when America delivered the final blow: atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which launched the world into the nuclear age. Next time, the Battle of Stalingrad. Over 60 years ago, a battle was fought in this Russian city that would be the turning point of the Second World War. It was one of the hardest fought battles of all time.
I'll be revealing what it was like for the German and Soviet soldiers who fought street by street and building by building.
And I'll be explaining how the leaders' tactics drove their own armies to the brink of destruction.